Here's a rough sort of family tree for mainstream Christianity. In the previous segment, we talked about early Christianity and then Latin-based versus Greek-based Christianity, which were in the west and the east of the Roman Empire initially, and then that empire went away. Finally, in 1054, there was a split between Pope-ruled Western Christianity and the Easterners, and that split still exists. The other most important split to know about in Christianity is the Protestant Reformation that happened in the 1500s. And the Protestant Reformation can be broken down into three other family groups of Christian churches. There's the Anglican Communion, which is ruled from England. There's the Magisterial Reformation, and then there's what historians now call the Radical Reformation. And we'll explain those. But the place to start is with the famous monk Martin Luther. The Protestant Reformation began in 1517 when German monk and theologian Martin Luther publicly protested certain abuses, certain common practices in the Catholic Church that he thought were wrong. Of course, he had no intention of starting a different religion or a different branch within Christianity. He was just a Catholic monk and a theologian who wanted to see these practices get cleaned up. One thing that bothered him the most was the selling of indulgences. Roman Catholicism had developed a doctrine of purgatory. Purgatory is supposed to be a temporary place where the saved suffer so as to purify them for sins committed after baptism, and this will make them ready for the presence of God. So even if you are among the saved, even if you're a good Catholic for your whole life, still you've committed sins, and you need to, as it were, pay for them and be purified from them in this place called purgatory. In the Middle Ages, it was commonly assumed that most people would have to suffer for a very long time in purgatory. The Pope who initiated the First Crusade, which we'll talk about later in this lecture, he promised instant escape from purgatory, that is, the granting of a plenary indulgence, a full indulgence, for those who would go on the First Crusade. And for those at home, they could get a plenary indulgence by contributing money to the crusade. By Luther's time, these indulgences had become a crass fundraising technique. They were used, for instance, by Pope Leo X to rebuild the Cathedral of St. Peter in Rome, and you could buy a specific number of years' worth of release for specific prices. So, for instance, if you donated one amount, you could get a year out of purgatory, another higher amount, 10 years, another amount, 100 years, and so on. One of the more successful fundraisers is quoted as saying, "As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs." Very often people were not giving the donation to get themselves out of purgatory early, but they were doing it for a recently departed relative. They felt really bad about Grandma who just died, and Grandma committed a lot of sins in her life, and they couldn't bear the thought that she was right then suffering in purgatory. So they were willing to give a donation to shorten her suffering. This practice was sort of marginalized by Pope Paul VI in 1967, but it is still on the books, and indulgences are offered not usually for money donations, but for other faithful actions. This wasn't the only abuse that Luther was up in arms about. He was also concerned about, for instance, the practice of selling relics, many of which were dubious, such as drops of Mary's breast milk or pieces of the true cross. Things like that sometimes were sold. It seemed to be obviously exploitative. There was also the concern of simony. Simony is the buying and selling of church offices. The position of bishop evolved to be a very powerful position. It would include a palace and grounds that could be rented out. It was a good job, and so rich guys would want to buy this job for their sons, and sometimes people were willing to sell it to them. So simony was a problem that Catholic Christianity battled for centuries, and it was still a big problem in the 1500s. Another problem was pilgrimage tourist traps. Luther himself, as a monk, traveled to Rome, and he was really excited to do it. He was in awe of the city. When he got there, he found that people were charging for all the famous sites in Rome, and it just really offended him and discouraged him, and he thought this kind of practice was wrong. He wanted to debate this. In response, in the year 1520, he was excommunicated. That means kicked out of the Catholic Church, and that was understood in the Middle Ages to guarantee one's damnation. Luther didn't think that he was damned, though. He was one of a number of strong-willed leaders in this period who wanted to go back to the Bible and to reform church practices in light of that. For instance, he reduced the 7 sacraments down to 2, just the 2 that are explicitly taught in the New Testament, that is, baptism and the Eucharist. He also rejected clerical celibacy, the practice of having monks and nuns who abstain from sex. As a matter of fact, he quit being a monk himself, and he married a runaway nun, and together they had a number of children. He was in real danger at various points for being caught and executed as a heretic. He appealed to German princes for help, to various rulers in German-speaking lands, and they protected him. Still, the assumption was that any coherent country has to have one religion, which is shared by the ruler and by his people. So rulers then felt they had to make a choice, and consequently Europe was divided between Reformed areas and Roman Catholic areas. In the 1500s and 1600s, there were a number of religious wars. Whole countries would go Protestant or Catholic following their ruler, and sometimes a fight would ensue. In Protestant countries, state-supported churches were established. Here's how it eventually panned out. Here are the parts of Europe which are nowadays traditionally Catholic and Protestant. So on this map, Islamic areas are in green, Roman Catholic areas are in blue, Eastern Orthodox areas are in red, and Protestant areas are in purple. You can see then that traditionally Protestant lands are England, Scotland, Northern Europe, basically, parts of Germany, the Nordic countries. Luther's movement eventually evolved into Lutheranism, to Lutheran churches. Another famous reformer, John Calvin. The churches deriving from him are called Reformed churches or Presbyterian churches. But there was another side to the Reformation. Historians now call Lutheran and Calvinist movements Magisterial Reformation, and they distinguish that from the Radical Reformation. Again, this is a name made up by much later historians. What these people were called at the time were Baptists and Anabaptists. Anabaptist means re-baptizers. They believed, based on their study of Scripture, that you should baptize a person only when they're old enough to believe the message of Christianity. So they would only baptize adult converts or kids that were old enough to understand the message. And they did not baptize babies, as Catholics did. Those in the Magisterial Reformation strongly rejected this and joined with Roman Catholics in persecuting the Anabaptists. In the Magisterial Reformation, they considered baptism to be a sign of membership in the church, sort of comparable to circumcision within Judaism. In the New Covenant, they taught one should be baptized as a baby. That brings you into the group. Present-day Baptists, Congregationalists, and Amish, they derive from various Anabaptist groups. And some of the Anabaptists were Unitarians. They did not believe in the Trinity. This was yet another Christian teaching that they looked back and could not find in the New Testament. And we'll talk about more what the Trinity is in the next lecture. Another major wing of Protestantism is the Anglican Communion. The American branch of this is called the Episcopal Church, or Episcopalians. This church split from Roman Catholicism when King Henry VIII wanted a divorce, and the Catholic Church said no to that. He saw the Catholic Church as a rival and was happy to seize English churches and their property and money for himself. By making the English Church independent of Rome, this opened the door to its becoming Protestant in a unique way. In doctrine, Anglicans are Protestant and very similar to Lutherans and Calvinists, that is, those in the Magisterial Reformation, but in style sometimes they're more similar to Roman Catholics. The Archbishop of Canterbury was before this the chief Roman Catholic person, the head bishop over all of England. There is still an Archbishop of Canterbury today who is in some sense the leader of the Anglican Communion. And these churches are not anymore just in the UK, but they're also in the United States as the Episcopalian churches, and they're all around the world. There are a good number of people in the Anglican Communion, for instance, within Africa. Now let's go a little farther back in history. The First Crusade was personally initiated by Pope Urban II in the year 1095. He did this in a public speech, which we have a couple different reports of. He had received a request for help from the Eastern Christian king ruling in Constantinople, what's now modern-day Istanbul. More and more of his territory had been taken over by Islamic rulers, and he was afraid that even his city was going to be under threat, and he sent a letter to the Pope asking Western Christians for aid. He had no idea what was going to result from this. The Pope essentially declared a holy war to liberate the Holy Land, that is, Jerusalem and Palestine, from the unbelievers, from the infidels currently defiling that land. At the time, the Jerusalem area was peaceful, although it had been earlier violently captured by Islamic invaders. And there were various instances where pilgrims were abused or prevented from reaching their goal. Urban II then called for armies to be raised to recapture this holy land. And you can see the route in red here of the various armies as they headed east toward Jerusalem. They went through Constantinople, and they scared the heck out of the king there, who had no idea they were coming. He quickly passed them on across the strait here so they could continue on their journey. These armies caught the Muslims divided and unprepared, and they beat them. They captured Jerusalem after a siege, and then they massacred many of the inhabitants. This was a holy war, a religiously motivated war, but there were other motives involved in crusading. A big one would be free land. Young war-making men wanted to make their fortune, and some of them briefly captured and held lands in the Middle East as a result of these battles. Further crusades followed after that. None were as successful as this first one. Most of these later crusades ended very badly, with armies not even making it to their target in Jerusalem. These armies weren't official armies of countries. They were private armies, and sadly these armies often behaved like mobs. And there were massacres of Jews along the way in some of these crusades. They were in a mood to kill for God, and in many cases they hated the Jews enough to kill them on their way to the Holy Land. Another notorious development in the High Middle Ages was the office of the Inquisition. This was established by the papacy and run by the Dominican order of monks. The office of the Inquisition was a general court with broad powers to prosecute. They could inflict imprisonment, torture, exile, or burning on Christian dissenters. A heretic is essentially a Christian dissenter. It's someone who teaches something contrary to Mother Church, and they know it's contrary, and they don't stop it when they're told to stop it. If you're deliberately contradicting the teaching of the Church, you are a heretic. In principle, the Jews were tolerated, partly because of the hope that they would eventually convert to Christianity. The Inquisition was intended to discipline wayward Christians. However, in some cases, it ended up being applied to Jews and Muslims. This office was finally abolished in 1834, and really nothing like it exists today. Throughout the Middle Ages, Christianity continued to spread. It spread specifically further into Northern and Eastern Europe, and this, to some extent, made up for its massive losses to Islam in the South and the East. Christianity had always been a missionary religion, at least in theory. There were some famous missions by the Jesuits in the late medieval and early modern eras that we're skipping over. But an important thing to know about is the missionary movement, which had roots in the 1700s, really got going in the 1800s and the 1900s, and it's still going today. This is largely within Protestantism, although there is Catholic missionary activity as well. Most notably, this missionary movement spread Christianity to Africa, to South America, to the Pacific Islands, to China, and to India. In taking their message to all of these places, missionaries have translated the Christian New Testament into thousands of obscure languages. In many cases, the missionaries would invent the written form of the language. Our next segment, the rise of liberal Christianity and the reaction against it.